Hello and welcome back to Acorn Hobbies. My name is Camden, and today we're going to be looking at the Set 2 meta-analysis for one of the first big events that we've had since Set 2's launch. This may be what the meta looks like at Gen Con, or at least a snippet of it. So, we're going to be taking a quick look at the 1K, the Atlas Games 1K that happened in Ankeny, Iowa. I wasn't able to make it to this event, but I have the deck breakdown here with all 30 players and what they ran. And then I have the top 8 decks that we're going to be taking a look at in just a moment. So if we look at the 1K deck distribution, this is 30 people fighting for a prize pool of $1,000. Here's the breakdown and what it looked like. So there was one Emperor Palpatine green, which, spoiler alert, won the whole thing. We'll talk more about that later. There were 4 Boba villain who were running yellow, 2 Boba villain that was running green. I can assume that was ECL. And then 1 Boba that was running blue. So overall, there were 7 of Set 1 Bobas here at this event. That makes up about a fourth of these total players. Now, there were 3 of the first set Hans. We have Han Yellow with one of them, and then 2 Han Greens. Han Yellow seems like it was running really high on that DJ tech combo. I think that Han Yellow actually has some legs now because Finnick is his second 7-drop that's really good. So you can now run Han Solo and Finnick as these big swings. But we also have a Han Green, one of which was in the top 8. So we'll take a look at that in a little bit. And then there were 3 of the new Hans from Shadows that are running green. I can imagine that's a very, very fast red-green ramp deck that's trying to get to crates, trying to get to maces, stuff like that. There was 1 Kylo Ren red. I can only assume that was some sort of hand hate deck that's just running really fast. 1 Bo-Katan blue. That's just the Mando deck. Then you've got Iden blue, which is a control deck that we've seen. 1 Thrawn blue. This seems like it's probably based off of the yellow-blue combo from Set 1, maybe leaning a little bit more into Set 2 cards with stuff like Pass the Rock, Fell the Dragon, and all that. There were 3 Rey Reds. There were no other colors for Rey. It was just Rey Red, one of which we will look at as the 8th place deck here in just a moment. There was 1 Cad Bane Red. I can imagine that was running Tarkin Town. It just feels like Tarkin Town is really, really good with his ability. So stay tuned for a Cad Red deck tech here soon. And then there's 3 Sabine Greens, which I imagine these all have ECL. It would be absurd if they didn't. There's 1 Mando Blue. I actually wonder if this was running Security Complex. I don't know for sure, but it feels like if it's running Mando Blue and you're running a bunch of Mandos in that yellow-blue category, it feels like having Security Complex is a good little boon. There were 2 Tarkin Yellows, one of which we'll see was the 3rd place deck. I can imagine the other one is very, very similar in content. And then finally 1 Kira Green, which feels like it's the updated of the Krennic or Iden Greens from Set 1. So why don't we hop right into this top 8 analysis. We're going to start with the 8th place. This is what made 8th. We've got Rey at the Death Watch Hideout. It's definitely a discard-focused deck with 3 Pillage, 3 Force Throw. In the sideboard, you've got 2 Forced Surrenders. It feels like it's a very mid-range deck that can skew towards control. The healing from Rey is huge. It is absolutely phenomenal to be able to stabilize on board with that. And you can use her action ability that says, action, pay 1 resource and exhaust this unit. Give an experience token to a unit with 2 or less power. You can do that to gain early control of the board. That way then you can survive 2 Rey's flip turn and heal back the damage that you took maybe from an aggro deck. And I think that it's a really strong combo. I am a little confused. I personally think that Tarkin Town is better than the generic 30 health red base. I feel like with Rey tending to have lower attack units, you typically want to have something that can finish off maybe these 3 5s that are dropping on turn 2 right now. So like R2 is great, but he's not great when he can't deal with 5 health. But yeah, I think this deck is really strong. It's got a lot of early game healing with Yoda, with Kanan. You've got Obi-Wan for some survivability. I do think that its top end is a little weird. There's obviously no Luke's. Luke feels like the best possible top end for almost any hero blue deck. Being a 7 cost 6/7 with Restore 3 that basically wipes most units off the board when he enters play, that's a big deal. I think that, it's just a weird omission. Maybe it was just a lack of having that card. That's totally understandable. But yeah, having Kylo Redemption and the Crate Dragon as your top end feels like there was some indecision. Kylo feels like a slower but potentially more explosive finisher because he can attack for 8 and can also buff up other units and stuff like that. Redemption also feels a little weird, just to have one of. Maybe it's that backup plan, something just rushes you down really quick, and as you're trying to sustain, you just need some heal. That can be really strong. And then finally, Crate Dragon is the new hotness. I think that it is really interesting. It's quite a choice. I imagine there were a lot more beyond the top 8. This is the only one that we're seeing in the top 8, I think. And it feels like a solid top end for this Rey deck. It just feels like Rey will struggle the most against aggro and will be able to do well against other slower decks with all this hand hate with pillage and force throw. It feels like she'll be able to hold a board pretty well. So maybe Crate is just there for those super heavy control decks. But, I think that this is a pretty solid deck. If I'm looking at certain cards I may want to swap out or cut, I definitely think Migs is one of those cards that feels really good on paper because you are discarding cards from either your hand or their hand. I do think that he's just so slow, and being a 2 cost 2/2 means he gets removed so quickly. Maybe with Rey becoming effectively a 3 cost 3/3 over the course of 2 actions, maybe that makes him a little bit better, but I can't see it too much. I really think that there are better options, especially with such a strong package of R2, the Green Squadron A-Wing, and Sabine for those early game plays. I really do think that Migs might be a 1 of or a 2 of in these sort of decks that happen when your opponent is just not ever going to smack one of your units, when you're facing those super fast aggros. Maybe Migs is really good and I need to test with him a little bit more, but what I've seen when I've played with Migs, it just doesn't seem to be good enough. I do love the Concord Dawn Interceptors, though. I think the Space Suite is really good in this deck. It's just a really low to the ground Space Suite with 3 Green Squadron A-Wings, 3 Red 3s, 3 Concord Dawn Interceptors, and 3 Disabling Fang Fighters. Honestly, it just feels really strong to have a really cheap but pretty aggressive space, early game with Red 3 and the Green Squadron A-Wing. And you can also be super defensive with the Concord Dawn Interceptors. Disabling Fang Fighter feels like it's going to be a staple in any sort of red deck during this set. Upgrades are just so big right now. It feels like you're not going to be able to play a red deck without at least having some in the sideboard. It's an interesting choice, I think, to have only 2 K2s when he feels like a strong way to close out games or to discard more cards. I personally probably would have swapped like a Yoda for a K2, but I can see the reasoning behind that. And looking at the sideboard here, it looks like the sideboard techs a little bit more. Tech. It techs a little bit more towards control. I think tech is a card that you bring in against super heavy control decks. It just gives you value. Forced Surrender is the same way. You're getting card advantage. They're not. When I've played Rey, it's been difficult sometimes to keep card advantage because you tend to play cheaper units with lower attack. So I can understand why Forced Surrender is good. I probably would have put 1 in the main deck, maybe even swapped out Kylo and an Obi-Wan to put 2 in the main deck. It feels like it's a good way to close out games. The Jedi Lightsaber is there because you have a lot of Force units between Yoda and Kanan and Obi-Wan and Kylo and then Rey herself. Feels like you just have so many good targets to put out Jedi Lightsabers. So I can totally see running 2 of those in the sideboard when your opponent is not running any upgrade removal. especially because Rey has so many upgrades that are flying around anyways with the form of experience tokens. Sometimes your opponent is going to spend their upgrade removal, getting rid of experience, and then you can drop a Jedi lightsaber and feel really good about it. The open fire feels like it's an anti-aggro thing, and Fell the Dragon feels like it is an anti-crate dragon thing, which, duh. But any sort of big deck where it's running huge, units like Redemption and Kylo and Crate and Poe, Fell the Dragon feels like that's the choice. If it were me, I do not know what they swapped out, but if it were me, I'd probably, with Fell the Dragon, remove Kylo and a Crate myself, or maybe even remove Disabling Fang Fighter if they don't have any upgrades, something like that. It just feels like Fell the Dragon is there in case there were tons of dragons running around, and I wish I knew more about whether or not there were more Crate dragons, but I can totally see it as a logical meta decision. I actually have a few of the other popular Rey Red decks, because this is a deck that's been kind of a pet of mine that I've been playing a whole lot of. I think that this deck is really interesting, but I have a few others who have built their own. So I want to compare them with Tower Number 9 and Thork's deck. So here's Thork's Rey Discard Midrange. This deck goes a little bit heavier with the top end, having 2 Redemptions, 3 Lukes, and a Crate Dragon. It feels like it's really banking on making it to the late game. It also only runs 1 open fire, but I think it makes the better decision of running 3 regional governors rather than 3 MIGs. I think regional governor is really strong with Rey. You're able to call something early, and then next turn it becomes a 2-5, and then turn after that it can become a 3-6. And then once it has a board presence, you're starting to trade, or maybe you're hitting face, and you're able to deal with this, this threat with a body that typically doesn't hit anything but after your opponent's claimed and it hits base. So I can totally see Regional Governor being a staple in these Rey decks. Otherwise, I think this is pretty standard. I like the inclusion of 3K2s. I think that this is a little bit more streamlined of a deck. So if it were up to me, this is what I would be running. I also think the sideboard, it feels a little bit more focused. I think Fell the Dragon is good, but when you've got Rivals Fall, you tend to be okay with that. You also have Force Throw where you can get rid of your own dragon, so that way then you can throw that at them, and that's really cheap removal. You're not taking a lot of damage off of a Force Throw, so I can totally see maybe running more Fell the Dragons if Crate Dragons become huge, but maybe sometimes the way to deal with a Crate Dragon is just get your Crate Dragon out earlier, and when you're discarding a bunch of cards from their hand, they typically won't want to have, or they won't have a Crate Dragon when they enter into that 9 resource turn, unless they top deck it, or you've just not hit any of your discard cards. So I can totally see this deck doing pretty well. And same thing with Tower Number 9s. Tower Number 9 goes a little bit heavier with more pose. It's a very consistent deck all the way through, running 3 copies of everything but the Jedi Lightsaber in the main deck. It also has Village Protectors and Cassian, which Cassian feels like more of this closer. You're probably resourcing him most of the time. I think it's okay. I don't know if that's what this deck is really going for. This feels a little bit less discard focused, even though it has 3 Pillage and 3 Force Throw. Just something about the way that it's constructed doesn't seem as much of a sustain deck, especially with Jedi Lightsaber. Queel is good, having Restore. I personally don't think you have enough red cards in this deck. I feel like Queel is really good. He's like a mono card. I think he's a mono blue. But maybe you're okay with just hitting it 1 in every 2 discards. Maybe you're okay with that. Or maybe the 2 cost 2/3 with the Restore is worth it. I really like this deck. I really like Rey Red. I think the Tarkin Town is the way to go. But otherwise, I really like this. I think that Rey Red will be a meta staple. And I can totally see this deck or the Atlas Games 8th place doing well. I think this deck will probably end up being more streamlined as time goes on, and probably will cut some of the more fun, flavorful cards like Kylo Ren. But yeah, that was our 8th place. Here at 7th place is Boba Blue. This is one of those super hard control decks that runs very, very few units in hopes that it can just keep things off the board and close it out with an Avenger. And that's what this is doing. You've got more units maybe than before, but that's probably because McClunky is strong, Dr. Pershing is strong, the client provides heal. I can totally see this deck just being as good as it was in set 1. It's very, very blue heavy, so he's got 3 Childsons in the sideboard. I can see the hesitancy with running a bunch of Childsons right now because Fell the Dragon is going to be around and Takedown. So that's 2 cards now that can take out Childson on the turn that he drops. Even if you're making him pretty big, you'd have to hit the like full Childson reveal 4 cards to make it Takedown proof, and you'd have to not hit many cards for Fell the Dragon proof. This deck also runs a bunch of the new bounties. It has 1 top target and 3 enticing reward. I think that's just, it's fun. Enticing reward feels like it's really, really good card draw in a deck like this. And top target is just good heal. Without many units, though, it feels like you're having a tougher time of like, it feels like you're not really paying for like this added bonus. You're actually paying for an added effect to your removal card. And I can see bounties entering into this deck. I don't know if they're ever going to become super mainstream. But yeah, I like this deck pretty well. It's definitely a hold the board down until you can get to Avenger. And if you don't win on damage, then you've got Bounty Hunter Crew to recur Vigilance. This has a lot of hand hate as well with Bazine and Spark. I mean, he's main decking 2 Sparks at a 4-cost card, which is kind of crazy, but I can totally see it just against that, hard control matchup. And as we look through here, there are definitely a fair few hard control decks that are floating around. So I can see Spark being around. I think Bazine is probably a little bit better now that she is an option. But yeah, this is a strong deck. It'll remain a strong deck. I think the sideboard probably shows a little bit more about what their local meta might have looked like. It seems like, you've got to make an opening for the Bobas and the Lurking Ties, stuff like that, where you're getting rid of those, the Defenders and the Lurking Phantoms. You've got another top target against an aggro deck. You've got another Spark against a control deck. You've got another Search Your Feelings against a control deck. A Super Laser Blast against a mid-range. A Snoke against aggro or mid-range. You've got Restock. That way then you have 2 of them against a hard control. And then Childson against aggro and mid-range. Like, it's a pretty strong sideboard that feels really directional. I really feel like this is a deck that had really natural upgrades with set 2. Snoke fits in really well. The Client is probably one that people will be experimenting with. I think that sometimes he's a little too slow, but a 2/5 shielded body, that can just be really strong. So I don't know exactly how it's going to end up looking, but this deck feels like it's probably not going to leave anytime soon. It's just a matter of time of whether or not enticing reward, top target, and the Client, like these bounties and all that, if that actually remains a part of the deck, or if you just go for this, I'll kill you with damage or kill you with mill strategy. I don't know if those help you get there enough, but time will tell. The 6th place deck is in set 1 Han Green, and this deck has a bunch of new cards in it, so I'm excited to talk about some of the combos here. There are other decks that or other videos that have explained the combo well, and I will link those here in the video. But DJ and Tech is a really crazy combo. Tech adds an instance of Smuggle that is an addition to DJ's, making DJ a 5-cost single yellow Smuggle. And when you play him using Smuggle, you can take control of an enemy resource, and while he's in play, that resource is in yours. In your control, and I think that is super strong when Han can then kill a resource, and it doesn't have to be a friendly resource that you own. It just has to be a friendly resource. So I think that's a really big deal. It can just lock opponents out of entire turns. You can make it so they never are able to get to a certain resource through Tech and DJ. So I can totally see that just becoming a combo that happens. I don't know if it's strong enough to really like hold decks out of the meta, but maybe if Han becomes consistent enough. Yeah, this seems super strong. I am confused by no Spark of Hopes. It feels like Spark of Hope is really good, especially with like Cloud Rider and Greedo just being these cards that are gonna die and can be resourced. But yeah, Syndicate Lackeys, we'll see as a theme as this goes on. It seems like it's probably there against the Sabine matchup. Having a 5-cost, 5-power ambush is pretty strong. If they don't throw a Darksaber on a Sabine, you're probably good. You're able to take her out. The Marauder also feels really strong, especially with Millennium Falcon like having now multiple copies, which of course they're not running multiple copies. They're not running the like set 1 and set 2 Falcon. They're just running the one. But I think Marauder is just a strong ambush anyways, so I can totally see it. Only one copy of Luke is obviously there for U-Wing reinforcement because he's out of aspect. You tend to not want to pay 9 for him, but maybe there's an odd chance that you will. I do like 3 home ones and 2 reinforcement walkers. It provides a lot of card advantage because you're getting recursion and you're getting draw. It's also a lot of healing with Restore 2 and other units getting Restore 1, and then the reinforcement walker being able to discard cards to heal. I think this is a strong deck. I think we'll see a lot of it. Looking at the sideboard, Bodhi feels like it is there for U-Wing reinforcement for very specific matchups, just if you need more discard. Spark does that well already. The Azatuk feels like it's probably against an aggro matchup, and Kira feels like it's going to control. I think Traitorous is probably against these little baby aggro decks, or maybe against Rey. Stealing a buffed up like R2 can be huge. Change of Heart feels like it's against these bigger decks, or maybe against the Tarkin yellow decks that are floating around. And then the Sundari Peacekeeper is one that I personally would probably put in the main deck. I think it's a really strong anti-aggro tool, and maybe because they're not running ECL, that's why it's in the sideboard rather than the main deck. But it feels like Han can sometimes struggle against aggro if there's not enough of your early anti-aggro cards in your hand. So rather than dying really quickly, I like having something that can hit for 3 and heal 2 every time it attacks. So I can totally see this deck just continuing to be good. I think this deck will probably be at Gen Con a fair bit. Han Green was a fan favorite in set 1, and it seems like it's not going to go away this set. So I expect to see a few of these floating around at Gen Con, and I definitely expect to see some past Gen Con as the meta kind of opens up a little bit more. I think this deck is going to be really, really strong. And here's Boba Yellow. Boba Yellow here at Jabba's Palace. This deck it's good. We've seen that Bad Guy Boba is good. We've seen that the new yellow cards are also good. So what I'm going to talk about here is actually a few of the new additions. This deck has a lot of new additions in it, which is crazy because yellow is super strong anyways, and it was strong in set 1. Set 2 is strong again. So here's what I think the most notable additions are in this deck. Having 6 total 3/3s on turn 1, absolutely huge. Dr. Evazan is crazy. Oftentimes you can kill him to make it so your opponent doesn't get the resources refreshed. As I talk to my boss deck tech, I actually think that sometimes he becomes too tanky, which is a really funny problem to have. I think that's just good design. It's very flavorful design that he readies 12 resources. But yeah, in a deck like this, I don't think you care. You're able to hit fast enough that you don't really mind that your opponent's going to have some resource refreshment. Fugitive Wookiee, honestly, the bounty feels a little bit worse because he's probably going to die turn 2. And if you have multiple, good units, maybe they save it and kill him on turn 2 or on turn 3 and exhaust your other unit. That can be one way to deal with some of these more pesky units. Boba Fett's armor is huge. You will win games just by getting Boba Fett's armor on him on turn 4. There's just no doubt about it. Like, if they don't have upgrade removal, Boba Fett's armor will run away. Boba becoming a 6/9 is huge, and just being able to smack face and refresh resources, it's nuts. There will be aggro decks that will never be able to deal with Boba Fett again because of his armor. I think the Lurking Tie is really strong. I think time will tell whether or not it's worth it to have 6 space units that functionally work the same with the Defender and the Phantom. Do you run both? Do you run just one? I think that right now Lurking Tie Phantom probably wins out ever so slightly just because it removes the potential to die to like power the dark side. That represents a lot of damage over the course of the game. If your opponent doesn't have good removal against it, then, it can just float around on the board. I think that it's really strong against these like hard control yellow blue and double blue and blue red decks. So I can see Lurking TIE Phantom ultimately winning out, but maybe it's worth it to just run all 6. I think Toro is really strong. You now have 6 3/5s to play on turn 2. It just feels like your turn 2 and your turn 1 got way better in this deck. And then, from that point on, you've got this, top end curve to round things out. You've got the Forlom Zuckuss combo, which I like. I think maybe Bosk ends up winning out over Zuckuss, even though the combo is fun to have a 7/7 Zuckuss ambushing in. But yeah, I can totally see Zuckuss being worth it in this mono yellow deck where you're going to have other threats on the board, and dealing with Forlom might not be the most important thing around. There are also bounty hunters to deal with Toro, so that just provides a good critical mass of that. Fet's Fire Spray, good card. Going to keep being a good card. You can use a new adventure to play it again. So many Fet's Fire Sprays. It's going to be awesome until you die to it, and then you're going to hate it and rip up all your copies because it is just so frustrating. But I do think that it's going to keep being good. Fet's Fire Spray is strong. It's going to be a fun card to play against as we figure out more and more what can stop it. There are a few different options in set 2, so I wonder if those will rise up if Boba Yellow keeps being a strong meta contender. And then finally, Final Showdown. I think this card is the rare instance where more than one copy feels wrong in a deck. I don't think you're going to consistently have a board big enough to win the game, but sometimes your opponent's just going to claim on the turn 5, 6 resource turn, and you're going to have just enough to eke out damage. I can totally see Final Showdown being something that wins you 1 in every 10 games. And honestly, if that's the case, it's well worth it. I can also totally see it as a sideboard card, so it all depends. I think the sideboard is also pretty pointed. Confiscate is against those super upgrade heavy decks. I can totally see it coming in against Sabine to remove Darksaber. I can see it coming in against Rey to remove lightsabers. Change of Heart is against those bigger, slower decks. Frozen and Carbonite is against any deck that I feel like has strong, restore or on attack abilities. And then Syndicate Lackeys, again, I think are against Sabine. It being 5 power against her feels like that's what you need. So I can totally see Syndicate Lackeys popping in instead of maybe Zuckuss and the Final Showdown, because you're going to be able to close out a game pretty well. I think this deck is really strong. I think it will remain really, really strong. Time will tell. Will the Phantom stick around over the Defender? Will they both be there? Is this the final iteration of the deck? Did it just kind of solve itself with all these new pieces? How many new adventures do you run? We'll figure out all that stuff. I think by Gen Con, we will see this deck be pretty refined, and it will take someone really breaking the meta with the yellow card choices to really see any innovation on it. But that's okay. It's a good deck. We're going to keep seeing good decks. So here's the top 4. This is Sabine Green. This is the deck that we thought was going to be the supreme number 1 deck for all of the set 1 meta, and ultimately that was not the case. So maybe set 2, there's some sort of revitalization. Maybe this, maybe Sabine Green gets better in set 2. I think that there's a chance. Cassian is really strong as the 3-cost 3/5 and also extra reach at 5 resources. He's also a rebel. He's one of the few rebels that got added this set. And I think that's just really strong to have a target for Wing Leader and Fleet Lieutenant. I totally see him just being a staple. I think that having Poe and Wrecker makes you have a much, much, much better top end, which of course your top end is still so much lower than everyone else's. But Wrecker is super strong as a 7/6 with Overwhelm that can deal 5 damage by defeating a friendly resource. And fun fact, he's the top of your curve, so it doesn't matter if you defeat a resource. You can just resource a card back next turn. I think it's totally worth it to run 3 Wreckers, and 2 Poes probably feels about right. As a 5-cost 6/6, he's going to be your best ECL target until you hit Wrecker, at least most of the time. Maybe every once in a while you want a K2. But I think that Poe is going to be super strong. Once he's on the board, you're going to be able to just use the cards in your hand as additional resources. You basically treat them as free copies of his effects that you are playing by discarding them with his on attack. I can totally see 2 copies of Poe. I can see 3 copies of Poe and swapping that out for some of these other choices. I also think that Heroic Resolve and Heroic Sacrifice, that's something that will be determined. I like Heroic Resolve a little bit better. Having a static +1/+1 and not having to defeat the unit is really good, but obviously it costs more because you have to pay 2 to get the +4 and Overwhelm. So I don't know if it's a 1-to-1 comparison. To me, it feels like Heroic Resolve is like adding an extra 4 causes because you're almost always going to have something on board until they just absolutely wipe your board. But it feels better to have a Heroic Resolve into your hand than a Heroic Sacrifice most of the time. I also think Timely Intervention. It's there just for K2, Poe, and Wrecker, and that's okay. That's good as a 2 of. It feels really strong to be able to ambush in a Wrecker and just do that overwhelm damage on the base. It's going to feel really good to do the same thing with Poe and with K2. Timely Intervention feels like it's worth risking the for a cause blanking on a couple of hits because at first I was not sold, but I think that having effectively 3 copies of ECL throughout the entire game is really, really strong. And it also makes your resourcing really easy in the early game because you can throw those down and then feel good about playing them from your resources later. Your sideboard is definitely tech to different styles. U-Wing feels like it's probably against more mid-range decks where you're trying to just have extra cards on board so they can't deal with them. Ketsu and the Disabling Fang both are upgrade hate, and Bright Hope is that aggro counter. I don't know if it's ever worth it to trade in Bright Hope. Having played Leia Red a lot in set 1, I found myself having Bright Hope want to enter my deck in the sideboard phase, but I ultimately found that it played a little bit worse with that unless there's a super duper space heavy deck like Tarkin Yellow. This is a deck that I don't know if I ever could have called before the preview started for set 2. But I think that this deck is going to remain a meta contender for at least a little while. This is a super similar deck to some of the other decks that have been floating around on YouTube and SwooDB. So we will be comparing those. Spoiler alert, it's not much of a comparison. There's only a 1 card change. But this deck feels really, really, really strong. Being able to triple dark raid for a bunch of different options is just great. Thork has a great video about this. I will link that here as well. He explains it way more in depth than I could, but basically the combo is that triple dark raid will hit a lurking tie. That way then you can swing into face. Or when you already have something on board, you can triple dark raid into a tie advance. That way then your tie advance can buff up that unit, you get it back to your hand, and then you can play it again for a greater buff. Or triple dark raid hits a pirate battle tank where the sentinel is able to immediately impact the game. Or it hits a reinforcement walker where it enters ready and you're healing a bunch or drawing a bunch. Or it enters play with the Architans, and the Architans gets to ambush into enemy units and steal resources. It feels really, really strong to triple dark raid. It definitely feels like it's better than sneak attack, at least right now, just because the resource doesn't have to come from hand. The resource of having a card doesn't have to come from hand. Tarkin also feels like the best way to run Incinerator Trooper, where you're getting that shoot first effect constantly. It feels like a good way to hold onto the early board. Tarkin's also the OG space 3-2 because you can run TIE Fighter and then buff it up. But yeah, I don't know if that's super great. Time will tell as to whether or not some of these early game cards are worth it. But maybe the ISP agent is worth it to ping 1 and become a 2/4. Maybe Piet is just good for those late game plays where you're having ATSTs and battle tanks and reinforcement walkers ambush into the board. The deck that this is compared to is this one. It's really high on SwooDB right now. The only difference is that they have 3 copies of Swoop Down and no copies of Waylay, whereas the top 8 deck, it has 2 copies of Swoop Down and 1 copy of Waylay. It also has a sideboard. Scanning Officer seems like it's against any sort of smuggle deck. I don't think you ever bring it in unless you're against Hondo or some super duper smuggle heavy deck. Maybe Lando. Yeah, probably Lando. But I don't know if we're ever going to see too much of either of those early. I think there needs to be a greater critical mass of good smuggle cards for that. Waylay feels very obvious. You're bringing it in against these bigger units, these upgrade-heavy units. Same thing with Change of Heart. It's just really good to be able to steal big units and make them work for you. And then Relentless and Devastator against your control decks. Relentless locks them down so they can't be destroying things. And with Triple Dark Raid, you can get it out early. And then Devastator is really strong to be able to Triple Dark Raid, because then you have a 10-10 Sentinel Overwhelm that nukes something when you play it. So I think this deck is going to be really strong. It's fun to see that Tarkin actually has a place in the meta, and it's going to be neat to see how people iterate on this and what vehicles and Imperial units end up getting run a whole lot, because there are a lot of strong ones in a bunch of different colors now. So I can totally see Tarkin Yellow being super strong and just running Triple Dark Raid into the ground. Like, this is going to be a fun deck to see. So yeah, this is one that I also think that people will be opinionated on as to whether or not Triple Dark Raid is busted. I think that you have to really build your deck towards it so it doesn't feel super busted to me. But maybe I'll play against it 100 times and get my face beaten in and think totally differently. But yeah, we will move on to the second place deck. This is the exact same deck as earlier. It's a second Boba Yellow. I don't know if this is meant to be the exact same deck or not. I don't know if that was intentional. But yeah, this is it. It is the second place deck. I don't know if there's a lot left to say other than I think this deck is strong. I think the Boba Yellow will remain good. And I think that it will take very specific decks to beat Boba Yellow consistently. Set 1, there was less options because basically every good yellow card was thrown into a deck. But now there's different flavors, having Evazan and Fugitive Wookiees over maybe Crafty Smugglers. You've got Boba Fett's armor, which feels like a staple, but maybe if you're not going all in on the Boba route. One thing I also forgot to mention is that Boba Fett unit on turn 2 and then turn 3 having Cartel Spacer and Boba Fett's armor makes Boba Fett into a 5/7 that takes 2 less damage. Like, that's really, really strong, especially with that on attack. Like, that's just wiping leaders, if you're throwing that out. Even with the new, leaders entering play rule thing. Like, I think that that's just super strong. This deck is going to be good. It's going to keep being good. It's deserving of second place, and congrats to the folks who are running it. And finally, this, I think, is the real spice of the day. This is what I never expected. It was Palpatine green. This deck caught me by surprise, but I think I see it. I think I see where it all works out. I think this deck actually may be one of the stronger control decks. Maybe Palp Double Green isn't, but I think Palpatine is finally there to be one of the stronger control decks. I think there's a good mass of cards that work really well with them. So we're going to dive into this one pretty heavily and work through the entire deck because I think the card choices are really, really crucial here. So the TIE Fighter as a 1-cost 2/1 vanilla unit, I think oftentimes this is one of those, you throw it out early, maybe you put it out with the Salacious Crumb. I think that's fine. It's also a space unit that Vader can hit. It's also really, really good to just kill with Palpatine. You play it, then you have Palpatine, just ping it, and you're drawing a card. I don't know if that's always your best play, but when he sticks around for a little while, yeah, you kill him, and you can, have him attack in, and then boom, he becomes 1 damage and a draw card. So I think that solid choice. I don't know that not everyone's going to have them in there, but in a mono green deck, I can totally see it. 2 Salacious Crumbs. He's a 1-cost green villain card. There's a 1/3 underworld creature. When played, you heal a damage from your base, and then you can action and exhaust him to return him to your unit, to your owner's hand, to your hand. And he deals 1 damage to a ground unit. So he becomes a ping as well, and he becomes recurring healing. I think that he's a really strong play when you're turn 2 Yularen Salacious to heal 2 when he enters play. So 3 total for the turn. I think that's just a strong play. I think 2 of is the right call. Admiral Piet, we've seen him be good. This obviously is meant to make Reinforcement Walker better and to have more officials. I don't know if I love this many Piets. I personally probably would have run 2. But we'll talk a little bit more about my card choices later. Colonel Yularen, he's a staple in Palpatine decks. He's an Imperial official who heals. He feels like he fits Palpatine's game plan perfectly. He will remain a constant in any Palpatine deck until a card that is better comes along. The Outland TIE Vanguard, I think this card is actually an anti-aggro card in this deck. Most of the time I would think the opposite, but with the amount of Sentinels that you have coming out on turn 2, then you're going to play an Outland TIE Vanguard and Yularen on turn 3. That allows you to buff up your Sentinels. So I think he's really good to make your Royal Guards, your Phase 3 Dark Troopers, your Black Sun Starfighters way better. Or maybe you just put him onto Yularen and suddenly Yularen's a 3-4. I can totally see it. It's also something that can be pulled from Vader, which is always worth noting. You got the Scanning Officer, which is new. I think having 3 of in this deck and the main deck is one of the few instances where it's totally worth it. It's an Imperial Official. It's a 2/3 at 2, and you reveal 3 enemy resources, and each one that has Smuggle gets defeated and replaced. It being an Imperial Official means that it probably would have at least been considered if it was just a blank text box. So the fact that this gives you a little bit of knowledge and potentially resource disruption is really good. So having that card is well worth it. And that's because it combos with Emperor's Royal Guard, where it matters that you have officials, and because you're playing Palpatine, that becomes a 3-cost 3/5 Sentinel as long as you played an official turn 1, which you have 9 of that you can play turn 1. So often you're going to be able to get that ERG online. I think it's well worth having that super high mass of officials, even if they're not great cards on their own. I think it's well worth it for the Emperor's Royal Guard aggro slowdown. Like, it's tough to chew through a 3/5. It's especially tough to chew through when you have to chew through it. So it's well worth having. Then you got Resupply, strong card. It's going to keep seeing play. You're obviously wanting to do some level of ramp in this deck. So against slower decks, more mid-range decks, where you can race the ramp, I think that it's worth having 3 of. The Phase 3 Dark Trooper, this feels like a really, really natural upgrade because Cell Block Guard saw play. And this is better Cell Block Guard. So whenever he takes damage and survives, you give an experience token to it. So he can just keep getting bigger. Really like weak units hate to see this guy. So yeah, easy choice. Again, can be pulled off of Vader. That gives you 6 total potential Sentinels because the ERG is not really always a Sentinel. But that gives you 6 potential ground and 3 potential space that can be pulled off of Vader. So it's super strong. You get that double whammy. I think that's totally worth it to hit that critical mass with 3-cost cards for Vader. Same with the Super Laser Tech. It's ramp. It's strong. It's going to keep seeing play. It's really good with Palpatine because you can kill him, which is nice when your opponent's not playing any ground units to try and stop that. Black Sun Starfighter, Sentinel, in space, 3/2, solid, can be pulled with Vader. It's going to see play as long as Vader sees play, I think. It's strong to kill or to have the option to block an A-Wing or to kill an A-Wing when it attacks. I think it's worth it. Command is ramp and damage and XP and all sorts of things all at once. I totally do think that the Command is probably the weakest of the mono color legendaries from set 1, but that's okay because it's ramp. It's also recursion. Sometimes that recursion is really worth it. I think that the damage being dealt to a non-unique unit is probably what really holds this card back. But when you're running mono green, you definitely want to have at least 2 of, maybe 3 of in your deck. And Palpatine can put them to good use. Giving experience to an Emperor's Royal Guard or a Yularen, that's just super strong. So yeah, Command is a really good follow-up play to some of those early game plays. And the Enterprising Lackeys are a good proactive turn 3 play as a 5/5 that when it's defeated, you can defeat a friendly resource. And if you do, you put this unit into play as a resource. It then smuggles for 6 and double green. So it's an infinite unit. You are able to play this from your resources at any time, which is really good because sometimes Palpatine Green ran out of an engine. Just wasn't hitting bigger cards because you want to run a critical mass of small cards. Enterprising Lackeys says you're never going to run out of 5/5s to play. So I think it's totally worth it to have 2 of. 3 of is probably a little bit of an overkill. Overwhelming Barrage. This is one that I'm probably a little bit more opinionated about than others. I think that Overwhelming Barrage really depends on how you build your Palpatine deck. This deck is much more unit focused, therefore I think it's worth it. But if you have many more events, especially in like a blue or a yellow Palpatine, I think OB can end up being a dead card in hand, so you might want to run 3. Here, for sure, though, you want to run 3, especially when you can command and buff up something with XP, or Outland TIE Vanguard and buff up something with XP, or maybe a Dark Trooper has survived, buff it up with XP, and then OB just starts wiping boards. Traitorous, good against Rey, good against aggro. When you're ramping into it and getting it out early, it can feel really debilitating to stop something that's been wing leadered or TIE Vanguarded or something like that. And then there's a big jump. There's no 6-cost cards. I think that's fine. You're going to be ramping through your 6-cost turn most of the time anyways. Palpatine really wants to get into that late game plays of the 7, 8, 9, 10 drops. So you want to hop on into Vader. He's a tried and true staple. I think that Palpatine probably still wants Vader over Maul, though we'll talk about that when we get to the sideboard. He's strong. He's ambush. He searches for board advantage. I think you totally want 2 of him, or 3 of him, and I think you definitely want at least 2 reinforcement walkers. I love to see a third one. It's just super strong, especially with Piet getting that wind plate and on attack combo all at once. Having card advantage or healing is really strong. The amount of games I've won with Palpatine where a reinforcement walker hits the board and I can't do anything about it and I'm healing up or drawing cards, it's awesome. So 3 of feels really strong, especially in a mono green deck. And then Relentless and Devastator are there for the control matchups or to close out a game. Big space units can be tough to deal with. Against the control matchup, Relentless is just wrecking things, and Devastator is defeating Avengers. Otherwise, Devastator is just a big unit that really space-heavy decks have a tough time chewing through. I don't know exactly how the matchups played out, but it feels like if this deck played against the Tarkin deck, then it probably had a decent shot at winning, even though it's not super space-heavy. Feels like Palpatine would have been able to use Traitorous and the Black Sun Starfighter, and then finally Devastator and OB to kind of close out that game. So yeah, the main deck is super strong. I think this is a really, really tight 50 cards. I could totally see certain cards being changed out, but ultimately, it feels flavored to taste. The core package feels there for a mono green Palp. I think that's awesome. If you look at the sideboard, you've got 2 copies of 5 different cards. Confiscate is there to defeat an upgrade. Obviously, there's not a lot of upgrade hate in this, so defeating a Darksaber can feel really, really strong. Strike True feels like it's against aggro when you're just needing extra damage to hit the board. It's good because you don't have to trade your units or anything like that. Fell the Dragon is there for, I think, exactly that. I think it's there in case crate dragons just run wild. You're happy to pay 6 for it because you're able to fell the dragon and only take 4. I think. Don't quote me on that. But yeah, it's good just to defeat crate dragons. Palpatine's Return is recursion against other control decks. It seems like it's the better Emperor's Legion now because you're able to actually get the unit back into play. You also have Force units with Darth Vader and then Maul, who's also in the sideboard. I think Maul is actually probably against strangely enough, against an aggro or mid-range where you're wanting that ambush and overwhelm. I can totally see it maybe against the blue-green control mid-range hybrid sort of decks where it's just worth it to keep board control. But yeah, Palpatine's Return is super strong. It's going to be great getting back tons of Vaders. So yeah, this deck feels really strong. I'm actually super excited to try this out. I may bring it to a locals here soon because Palpatine's awesome, and I'm hyped to see him keep doing better and better and better. So yeah, it's a well-deserved first place. It seems like it was a very well-thought-out deck. So I'm excited to see how Palpatine keeps looking in the future. But yeah, as we go into Gen Con, we're just a few weeks away from really the largest official. Well, it is the largest official that we've had so far, but one of the largest tournaments that we've had since the game's launch. So obviously there's a lot going on with Set 2 having just released. So I'm excited to see what else is going to happen at Gen Con. If you think that Palpatine is going to win Gen Con, I want to see what decks you're running, because I love Palpatine, and I think that all 4 colors are really, really viable with him now. He feels like the premier, like super duper heavy control, greedy control, maybe not just the heavy control, but like the greedy control deck, because he's in the ramp color and is able to splash in a bunch of really good removal or board control, or, direct from hand damage on the units, like stuff like that. So I think Palpatine will remain a staple. It's fun to see such an iconic villain just constantly hit the table, and I'm excited to see him keep it on. So yeah, let me know what you're running with Palpatine. And again, as I mentioned in the Bosk deck tech, if you comment below, then I'm giving away a set 2 common uncommon playset. That's a way to help get your friends into the game, or maybe you're a new player and just looking to grow your card collection. So you can comment below your favorite card, and we will choose at the end of the month. Here at Acorn Hobbies, we're going to choose one person, and I will send them common uncommon playsets. So thanks for checking out this video. If you enjoyed it, give it a like and a subscribe. That means a lot to me as the channel is starting to grow. This is only video number 2, but I'm excited to see where Acorn Hobbies is going to go with these unlimited videos. But until then, I will catch you all in the next one.